Anyway, so when this, what I realized is that the English language academic literature on Cuba was all working within the same paradigm of interpretation, right? And then I started to look into it when I started my PhD, which was on the economic ideas and work of Ernesto Che Guevara. I'm sure you've all heard of him, but maybe you don't associate him with that gritty, difficult work of actually, managing an economic, social, and political transition from a semi-colonial capitalist country to an independent socialist state, right? Just 90 miles from the shore of the United States. So he was really important in that transition, which he was clear was in some ways more difficult than the actual revolution. So I looked into this Cubanology, and I started to find out, because Cubans had written about this, that actually this was a strategic plan, right? So what had happened is the Cuban Revolution took place on, we all know, the 1st of January 1959. And Batista fled with his cronies, and they packed the suitcases of cash and they left the country. And, no one took it that seriously. They thought it was an irritation that could be removed quite quickly. But after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which the Cubans called Playa Giron, when, Cuban exiles were supported, trained, some of them financed by the CIA and other US interests to invade Cuba, and they thought they could easily overthrow the revolutionary government, and it was defeated in 72 hours. It's like a wound that the United States has never got over. And we can talk about, their vengeful attitude to Cuba. They're totally unforgiving, which is expressed today, exemplified today by the attitude and the endeavor of Marco Rubio to carry out a silent genocide against the Cuban people with the oil blockade and so on. So after the Bay of Pigs, Cubans robustly defeated the invasion in 72 hours. They rounded up prisoners and they swapped them for baby food. I mean, it was a total humiliation for the United States. And then the Pentagon, the State Department, the Ford Foundation, which has very strong links to the CIA, started to recognize that Cuba was a more difficult and complex enemy. And in order to understand it and to combat it, they would need research institutes that were set up, right, dedicated to two endeavors. The first objective was to rubbish all of the achievements that Cuba was making, right, to discredit them, so that people wouldn't be inspired by Cuba. If you think about this, Cuba had human development indicators on a par with Haiti, today. And within one generation, so I'm talking about like the mid to late 1980s, one generation of the Cuban Revolution, they had human development indicators that were on a par with the advanced capitalist countries or the imperialist countries, right? And what kind of example does that show to the impoverished masses around the world in capitalist countries colonized under exploitation of imperialism? It's an extremely dangerous example to, to the people of the world, right? Both in the capitalist imperialist countries and in the global south. So, on the one hand, distract from their achievements and build negative narratives so people don't look to Cuba as an example. And on the other hand, to actually use scholars, academics, to provide information that could then be used to plan actions. Right. And this goes from the extreme. So you can have this school of interpretations called Cubanology. So you can have right wing and left wing Cubanologists, but, they might have subtleties of differences in their interpretation, but they all stick with the key tenets, right? The revolution of 1959 disrupted a process of natural development that would have led to prosperous capitalism. Fidel Castro, then Raúl, personally dominated all decision making and policy making, as if Fidel was, running around doing everything himself. They never talked about anyone except Fidel. And, the way to understand changes in Cuban policy is actually about Fidel Castro's biological stage. So he's young and idealist, and then he starts to mature and become a pragmatist. And this stuff, you don't even have to dig deep to see these kind of interpretations, right? So the psychological bent of Fidel Castro somehow determines Cuba's destiny, but not of Ronald Reagan, of George Bush, or any of the previous, US presidents. So those are one of the tenets. The other is that Cuba's economic growth has been negligible. The gains of the revolution have been basically attributable first to Soviet aid, and then it was Venezuelan aid. And so these are the key tenets. And you can have people on the right wing of Cubanology, like Edward Gonzalez, who wrote reports for the CIA to help them develop programs aimed at what they very openly has been their objective of US-Cuba policy since 1960, which is regime change. And actually, talking about US policy, I mean, today we are seeing the clearest expression of the policy that was originally laid out in April 1960. And if any of you haven't seen this, it's a one-page document. It's freely available on the internet, and it was written by a man called Lester Mallory, who was a US diplomat. And they're tackling the problem of what to do about Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And the memo is called The Decline and Fall of Fidel Castro. This is 1960. It's before the major nationalizations. It's before Cuba declares it's a socialist country. And the document recognizes the popularity of the new revolutionary government. And it also recognizes there's some influence of communists in the leadership. Although this is, as I said before, the Cubans have said this is a socialist revolution. And it says that an attempt to invade, actually they try and do this later with the Bay of Pigs, would not be successful. So what we recommend is to use economic warfare against Cuba to to create such difficulty that the population turns against its government, right? And this is the wording they use is to create hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So what we're seeing today is actually the fulfillment of that policy. They have not been successful for 67 years. And the Cuban Americans, who are relentless, they will not, the right-wing lobby in the United States, they will not compromise. They don't care about humanity, humanitarian issues. They will push and push now. They are desperate to take this policy to its extreme. And what we're seeing is an attempt at genocide, because if you do not allow a country to get any access to oil, when it's highly dependent on oil or fuel for transport, you threaten any partners it has internationally to, that they cannot engage with Cuba. Even donations are being sort of criminalized and so on. Then what you're attempting to do is kill 10 million people on the island. And it doesn't matter what their ideology is, they are all suffering. So the final thing I'll say, because I don't want to overstep I don't know how long I've been talking, but the final thing I'll say is this has been accompanied, this attack, this economic warfare, by, again, a narrative of negative portrayal of Cuba. Cuba is a dictatorship. Cuba violates human rights. Cuba engages in human trafficking when its doctors are serving underserved populations around the world. And you can see that very clearly. The effort is to turn Cuba into a pariah state so that we don't do things like we're doing now, and we talk about the reality and then understand our duty to defend Cuba from this silent genocide and from this imperialist attack.